Harry, a man burdened with loss and a quiet life full of struggle, stumbles upon a missing little girl on a cold autumn day. His simple act of kindness, offering her food and calling the police, sets off a chain of events he never expected. What begins with compassion leads to hope and renewal, which change lives. Harry's life was a patchwork of losses, each more devastating than the last. As a young man, he was known for his unyielding determination, his hands calloused from hours spent in the factory, then later in a carpentry workshop. Every nail he hammered, every board he sanded, was driven by a singular purpose: to provide for his family. He wasn't wealthy, not even close, but he was proud of the modest life he had built with his wife and children. But life, with its cruel twists, seemed to single Harry out for trials he could never have imagined. It began with whispered conversations late at night, the ones his wife thought he couldn't hear. Then came the discovery, a betrayal that cut deeper than any wound he'd known. His wife left, taking their daughter with her. The court sided with her, and soon Harry was not only separated from the woman he had once loved, but barred from seeing his little girl. As if that pain wasn't enough, tragedy struck again. Their son, the quiet, bookish boy who had always stayed close to Harry's side, fell ill. Cancer took him quickly, leaving Harry standing by a grave, clutching a handful of soil he couldn't bring himself to release. Now, Harry lived alone in a crumbling house on the edge of town. The roof leaked when it rained, and the windows rattled in the wind. His pension barely covered the bills, and each trip to the grocery store was a careful calculation. But Harry wasn't bitter. He simply carried on, moving through his days with a quiet resignation. There was one thing that kept him going, a flicker of light in the shadow of his grief, a dream he'd nurtured since childhood. Harry often imagined himself in a small cottage surrounded by fields, tending to chickens, goats, maybe even a dog. He could almost hear the soft clucking of hens and the rustle of leaves in the orchard he would plant. But the years of loss and hardship had pushed that dream further and further out of reach. This was Harry's reality. The cold autumn wind bit at Harry's face as he shuffled down the cracked sidewalk, his coat buttoned tightly against the chill. The grocery store was only a few blocks away, but the walk felt longer than usual. Each step echoed a lifetime of weariness, the kind that settles deep into the bones. The gray sky above mirrored the dull ache in his chest, a constant reminder of the life he had lost. As Harry approached the small store, the smell of baked bread and faint traces of coffee from a nearby cafe wafted through the air. He reached for the door handle, then froze. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something. A small figure sitting on the wooden bench just outside the entrance. It was a girl, no older than 8, huddled against the wind. She wore a threadbare coat that seemed far too light for the weather, and her shoes were scuffed and damp. Her tiny hands clutched a ragged cloth doll, its stuffing peeking out from a tear in one of its arms. Her head was bowed, her hair tangled, and she seemed to be talking softly to herself, or perhaps to the doll. Harry hesitated. People passed by without a glance, some too busy with their own errands, others deliberately avoiding looking her way. Something in the scene gripped him, a sharp pull of concern that wouldn't let him turn away. He stepped closer, his boots crunching against fallen leaves. "Hey there," he said, his voice as soft as the wind would allow. The girl flinched slightly but didn't look up. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" For a moment she didn't respond. Then slowly she lifted her head, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and eyes filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She shook her head silently, clutching the doll tighter against her chest. Harry crouched down to her level, ignoring the creak of his knees. "Are you lost?" he asked gently. "Where are your parents?" At this, the girl's lip quivered, and fresh tears welled up in her eyes. She managed to choke out, I don't know." Her small voice trembled with the weight of her confusion and fear. Harry's heart sank. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone rushing toward them, but the street remained impassive, busy, and indifferent. He took a slow breath, his mind racing. "All right," he said, keeping his tone calm. "Let's figure this out. First, let's get you something to eat." He straightened up, his decision made. Inside the store, Harry selected a fresh loaf of bread, the kind that was soft and warm to the touch. He paid quickly, ignoring the cashier's raised eyebrow at his uncharacteristic urgency, and returned to the bench. The girl was still there, her small frame hunched against the cold. "Here," he said, tearing off a piece of the bread and handing it to her. "Eat. It'll help." The girl took it hesitantly, her fingers trembling as she held the warm crust. She nibbled at it slowly, her eyes darting between Harry and the ground. While she ate, Harry pulled his old flip phone from his pocket, his hands stiff from the cold. He dialed the local police station, his voice steady as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. "Yes, she's safe for now," he said, glancing at the girl. "But she's lost, and she doesn't know where her parents are." The dispatcher assured him that an officer would arrive shortly. Harry hung up and looked at the girl again, who was now eating more confidently. She glanced up at him for a fleeting moment, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude, though the tears hadn't fully stopped. Harry sat beside her, keeping a careful distance as they waited. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the helplessness of a child, the uncaring world that had left her there, and the faint stirrings of something he couldn't yet name. The wail of sirens cut through the chilled autumn air, growing louder as the police car pulled up to the curb. Harry stood by the bench, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets, watching as two officers stepped out. The girl clung tightly to her doll, her bread now half-eaten, her eyes darting between the flashing lights and Harry's face. One of the officers, a young woman with a steady but kind demeanor, approached them. "Sir, are you the one who called?" she asked, her gaze shifting briefly to the girl. "Yes," Harry replied. He gestured to the child. "She's lost. Says she doesn't know where her parents are." The officer crouched down to the girl's level, her voice softening. "Hi there, sweetheart. Can you tell me your name?" The girl hesitated, glancing at Harry as though seeking reassurance. He gave her a small nod. "Lily," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Okay, Lily," the officer said gently. "We're going to help you find your parents. You're safe now." The other officer, a tall man with a notepad in hand, approached Harry. "Do you know anything else? Did she tell you where she might have come from?" Harry shook his head. "No, she just said she was lost. I found her sitting on the bench crying. Bought her some bread to settle her nerves." The officer jotted down notes, nodding as he listened. "Thanks for stepping in," he said. "Not everyone would have done that." "I didn't do much," Harry muttered, glancing away. "Just couldn't leave her there, is all." The first officer held out her hand to Lily. "Come on, honey. Let's get you somewhere warm while we figure this out." Lily clutched her doll tightly and glanced at Harry again. "Will you come too?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harry's heart twisted. He crouched slightly so they were eye level. "You're going to be just fine," he said. "These folks will take care of you. You're in good hands now." Lily hesitated, then nodded. She took the officer's hand, her steps reluctant but steady. The officers exchanged a few more words with Harry, thanking him for his help before guiding Lily into the squad car. As the car door shut and the sirens wailed once more, Harry stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching the vehicle disappear around the corner. For a moment, the street seemed eerily quiet, Harry adjusted his coat and started the walk home, his breath visible in the cold air. He didn't look back at the bench. His thoughts were heavy, but there was a small measure of relief. At least she wasn't alone anymore. Harry was halfway through his modest dinner of reheated soup and a slice of stale bread when the shrill ring of his old landline phone startled him. It wasn't often the phone rang. It was usually only telemarketers or the occasional wrong number. Setting down his spoon, he shuffled over to the small table by the window where the phone sat. "Hello?" he said, his voice gruff but curious. "Mr. Harry?" The voice on the other end was calm and authoritative. "This is Inspector Johnson with the local police. I hope I'm not calling too late." Harry's brow furrowed. "No, it's fine. Did something happen?" There was a brief pause before the inspector continued. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did earlier today. We've located the parents of the girl, Lily. They've been looking for her everywhere, and they're deeply grateful for your help. They'd like to meet you in person to thank you properly." Harry gripped the phone a little tighter, his free hand reflexively rubbing the back of his neck. "Meet me? That's not necessary. I just did what anyone would have done." "Maybe so," Johnson replied, "but they insist. They were very clear about it. I've been asked to give you an address, if you're willing." Harry hesitated, his mind racing. It had been years since anyone went out of their way to express gratitude to him. Why did they want to meet? What could he even say to them? But the inspector's tone left little room for refusal. "All right," Harry muttered. "I'll go." "Good. The address is—" Johnson rattled off the details, which Harry hastily scrawled onto a scrap of paper next to the phone. "They'll be expecting you tomorrow morning at 10. Just let them know when you arrive." Harry nodded absently, though Johnson couldn't see him. "Got it. Thanks for letting me know." The call ended, and Harry stood there for a moment, staring at the address. He had never been to this part of town, known for its wide streets lined with stately homes. For someone like him, who had spent most of his life in modest neighborhoods and blue-collar surroundings, it might as well have been a foreign land. The next morning, Harry dressed in his cleanest clothes, a simple button-down shirt and a worn but tidy jacket. He caught a bus, his mind swirling with uncertainty. The ride felt endless, each stop bringing him closer to a situation he couldn't quite comprehend. When the bus finally pulled up near the address, Harry stepped off and froze. In front of him was a grand estate, the kind of place that seemed ripped straight from a magazine. Tall iron gates surrounded a sprawling lawn, and a long driveway led to an elegant house with pristine white walls and large bay windows. Harry adjusted his jacket and approached the intercom by the gate, his stomach twisting with unease. Before he could press the button, the gate buzzed and swung open, as if they had been watching for him. "Come on in, Mr. Harry," a man's voice said through the intercom. Taking a deep breath, Harry stepped onto the property, his boots crunching against the gravel path. He felt out of place, like an intruder, but curiosity pushed him forward. At the door, he was greeted by a sharply dressed man who introduced himself as the family's assistant. "This way, please," the assistant said, leading Harry inside. The interior of the house was even more overwhelming. Marble floors, chandeliers that sparkled in the morning light, and walls lined with tasteful artwork. Harry felt a pang of self-consciousness as he followed the assistant through a wide hallway and into a sitting room where two figures waited. The moment he stepped in, a woman rose from her seat. Her eyes were red, as though she had been crying, but her expression softened with gratitude when she saw Harry. A man stood beside her, tall and composed, but his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of exhaustion. "You must be Mr. Harry," the woman said, stepping forward. "I'm Lily's mother. Thank you so much for what you did for our daughter." Her voice cracked, and she covered her mouth briefly before composing herself. Harry shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "I didn't do much," he said finally. "Just made sure she was safe until help arrived." "You did more than you realize," the man said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We thought we'd lost her. She wandered off during a crowded event, and we were terrified." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "When we heard about how you stayed with her, how you fed her and called the police, we knew we had to meet you." Harry stood awkwardly, his hands in his pockets, as their words washed over him. He still didn't understand why they had gone to such lengths to thank him, but something about their sincerity made it impossible to turn away. Harry nodded awkwardly. "Of course. How's Lily?" "She's safe," the man interjected, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "She told us about you, how you stayed with her, bought her bread, called for help. You have no idea what that means to us." "We lost her during a charity gala," the woman added, her voice breaking slightly. "The crowd, we thought she was right next to us, but she wasn't. It was a nightmare." She took a shaky breath. "And then you found her." Harry shifted his weight, unsure what to say. "I just couldn't leave her there." The woman stepped closer, her hands trembling. "You saved our daughter. We can never repay you for that, but we want to try." Harry blinked, startled by the intensity of her gratitude, and glanced at the man, whose nod confirmed her words. Harry shifted awkwardly in his chair as the man placed an envelope on the table between them. "Please," the man said earnestly, "take this. It's the least we can do." Harry hesitated, glancing at the envelope. "I appreciate the gesture," he said, his voice low, "but I can't take your money. I didn't do it for a reward. I just couldn't leave her there." The woman leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Harry," she said gently, "we understand how modestly you live. Lily told us how kind you were, how much you cared. You deserve more than just words of thanks." Harry shook his head. "I've gotten by all these years without much. I'll be all right, really." The couple exchanged a look, their expressions resolute. The man spoke next. "Lily also mentioned your dream, a small farm, animals to care for. We looked into it. It's not charity, Harry. It's our way of honoring what you did for our family." Harry's brows furrowed. "You... what?" The woman reached out, placing her hand over his. "We found a property just outside the city," she explained. "A cottage, a garden, room for animals. It's everything you described to Lily. Let us give you this, not as payment, but as gratitude." Harry opened his mouth to protest, but found no words. The sincerity in their eyes was overwhelming. Finally, he exhaled deeply, his hands trembling. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "Say you'll accept it," the man urged, a small smile tugging at his lips. A week later, Harry stood in front of a quaint cottage nestled in a patch of green hills. The garden, though overgrown, held promise, and the small barn was sturdy enough for a few animals. Behind him a truck pulled up, and a man unloaded a crate of chickens, a goat, and a bounding puppy, who wagged its tail furiously. Harry's chest tightened as he took it all in. For the first time in years, his heart felt light. He reached down to pat the puppy's head, a smile spreading across his face. Each morning, Harry stepped out onto the creaking wooden porch of his new cottage, greeted by the crisp air and the soft hum of nature. The puppy, now named Scout, bounded ahead of him, tail wagging furiously as it chased after the chickens pecking in the yard. The goat, Daisy, let out a playful bleat, nudging at the gate of her pen as if impatient for his attention. Harry chuckled, bending down to pick up a handful of feed. "All right, Daisy, I'm coming," he called, his voice lighter than it had been in years. As he moved through the garden, Tending to the rows of freshly planted vegetables, Harry's thoughts often drifted back to Lily. He could still see her tear-streaked face as she sat clutching that worn doll, could still hear the soft tremble in her voice when she said, "Will you stay?" Scout barked, breaking his reverie, and Harry turned to see the dog nosing at a small patch of wildflowers growing near the fence. A smile tugged at his lips. The sight of Scout's enthusiasm, the quiet rhythm of life here, it all felt like a dream he never dared believe could come true. Later that afternoon, as he leaned against the fence watching the sun dip low over the hills, Harry thought of the couple who had given him this chance. For the first time in years, he whispered to himself, "Maybe this is where I'm meant to be." One afternoon, as Harry rested under the shade of the old oak tree in his yard, Scout curled at his feet, he noticed a car pull up the long dirt path. He stood brushing his hands on his trousers and watched as Lily and her parents stepped out. Lily ran toward him, clutching a small bundle in her hands. "Mr. Harry," she called, her face lighting up with joy. Harry knelt down to greet her. "Lily, what brings you here?" She handed him the bundle, a small painting she had made, a bright, colorful depiction of the cottage surrounded by animals. "I wanted you to have this," she said shyly, "because you made my family happy." Harry smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Lily, but it's you who reminded me how powerful kindness can be." Her mother stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes. "You didn't just save our daughter, Harry. You reminded us that even the smallest kindness can ripple into something extraordinary." Harry nodded, his gaze shifting to the lively scene of his small farm. "And it seems it's brought me right where I belong.